what if the most fundamental part of your very sense of self isn't really what you think it is? What if it's maybe in some really profound way an illusion? Imagine looking in the mirror, but instead of seeing just you, a fixed individual, you glimpse something, I don't know, more fluid, interconnected, or maybe even not really there.
Okay, let's try and unpack this a bit. Today, we're doing a deep dive into one of humanity's oldest, most persistent mysteries, the nature of the self. We're going to explore how vastly different Eastern-Western philosophies and even psychologies approach this really fundamental question. You might actually be surprised at how much common ground there is, but also how much radical difference exists between these worldviews.
Indeed. And we've got a really fascinating stack of sources to help us navigate this. Everything from, ancient Vedic wisdom literature from India all the way to modern cross-cultural psychological research. We even dipped into some contemporary online discussions to see how people are grappling with this stuff today.
And our mission really is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights, to help you navigate these incredibly complex ideas. We want to understand not just what these different traditions are saying, but crucially, why it matters for how we live our lives, how we find well-being, and, ultimately how we see our place in the grand scheme of things.
And hopefully this deep dive will give you a bit of a shortcut. A way to get genuinely well-informed on a topic that, let's face it, can feel pretty overwhelming otherwise. All the academic jargon, ancient texts.
Yes,
we're aiming for those aha moments, those little surprising facts or connections that make you stop and maybe rethink something you've always just taken for granted. And just to set the stage quickly, broadly speaking, Western thought has often really centered the individual self, putting your right at the core.
Yeah,
exactly. Whereas Eastern traditions quite often challenge that, or even outright deny the inherent existence of a distinct, separate individual self. So this tension, this pull between a solid, independent I and maybe a more fluid, interconnected, or even absent self, that's really the core thread we'll be pulling on today. Okay, so let's start with what's probably most familiar to a lot of us listening, the conventional Western view of the self. When we talk about ourselves, our identity, our personality, Western psychology, historically anyway, has put a huge amount of weight on the ego, right? It's like the captain of the ship.
It absolutely is, or at least that's been a dominant view in much of traditional Western thinking. I mean, if you go back to foundational figures like Sigmund Freud, his structural model of the psyche is a classic example. He positioned the ego as this key component, the mediator.
Mediator between.
Well, think of it as the rational part, the bit that deals with reality. It's constantly trying to balance those raw, primal desire, the id, he called it, with our internalized moral compass, the superego. And all while trying to navigate the actual demands of the outside world. So yeah, it's about control, it's about adaptation, keeping a coherent sense of me in relation to everything else.
Okay.
And for a long, long time, Western psychology was really focused on observing behavior, categorizing it, and crucially altering observable behavior. This focus naturally led to therapies aimed mostly at diagnosing and treating psychopathology, what's considered maladaptive behavior.
Fixing problems.
Exactly. And the underlying assumption there was pretty direct. If you change someone's external actions, you'll sort of kickstart a positive change in their internal thoughts and feelings. Change the outside, the inside follows.
And you can totally see how that filters down into everyday understanding, can't you? Even outside of clinical settings. Just think about the whole self-help industry. So many books, programs, they're all built around ideas like strengthen your ego or find your true self.
Oh, absolutely.
The implication is always that this self is this single, individual, kind of fixed thing that just needs discovering or boosting or optimizing. It's very much about the I in this really concrete, distinct, almost possessive way. My ego, my true self. But here's where it starts to get really interesting, I think. Because even within the West, this idea of a stable, unified self hasn't just gone unchallenged. There are some pretty major philosophical figures who actually sound quite similar to what we'll hear later from the East. It's almost like they reach similar questions, but from totally different starting points.
Precisely. Take someone like David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher and empiricist. He famously argued that the self isn't some constant, enduring thing, but actually an illusion.
An illusion? How so?
Well, Hume said when he looked inward, when he really introspected, he couldn't find any persistent, unchanging self. What he found instead was just this rapid succession of perceptions, thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, just constantly changing.
Okay.
He used that famous metaphor of consciousness being like a theater where different perceptions just appear one after another. But, and this is the key bit, he said there's no constant stage, no underlying actor. There are only the changing contents, the perceptions themselves. So for Hume, the only thing that really exists in that inner world is the flow of experience itself, not some stable self that owns those experiences.
So it's like watching a movie where the scenes, the characters, everything's always changing, and you assume there's some consistent movie holding it together. But Hume's saying, nope, there's just the stream of images itself. Is that kind of it?
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, captures his point really well. And then you jump forward to more contemporary thinkers like Patricia Churchland, who's a big name in eliminative materialism. She takes an even more radical stance. She basically denies the existence of the self or consciousness as distinct things at all.
Wow. Okay, so what are they then?
For her, what we call self or mind, these are just terms from folk psychology. Convenient ways we talk about complex brain processes, but ultimately inaccurate. She argues that as neuroscience gets better, these folk concepts will just be eliminated, replaced by more precise neurological explanations. It's a bit like how the idea of phlogiston, that old idea of a fire-like element, got replaced when we understood oxygen and combustion.
So the self is like phlogiston, just waiting to be explained away by brain science.
That's the eliminative materialist view, yeah. And then you have others, like Georg Hegel, the German idealist. He got really interested in the paradox of the self trying to think about itself. He pointed out that to do that, the self has to make itself an object of its own thought, which creates this weird self-referential loop that never quite settles into a fixed, independent self. It's like trying to grab your own hand with that same hand the grabber is also the thing being grabbed. You can never quite step outside yourself to get a firm hold.
Huh. Trying to grasp the ungraspable.
Right.
That makes sense. Now, it's important, though, to contrast Hume's view, the empiricist view, with someone like Immanuel Kant, right? Because Kant responded directly to Hume.
Absolutely. Kant acknowledged the problem Hume raised. Yeah, the self we experience day to day, the empirical self, it's fleeting, it changes. But Kant argued there must be some underlying unifying principle for us to even have a coherent experience of the world at all, for our perceptions to make sense as our perceptions, belonging to one me.
So what did he propose?
He posited the self as a thing in itself, or a noumenon. He called it the transcendental ego.
Okay, transcendental ego. What does that mean exactly?
It's basically a pure, unchanging consciousness that isn't something you can directly know through experience. You can't observe it or introspect it like a thought or a feeling. But, he argued, it's absolutely necessary for experience itself to even be possible. It's the original necessary awareness of your own identity, the kind of background unity that makes coherent thought and perception possible.
Ah, so it's like the invisible stage Hume couldn't find. The thing that makes the play possible, even if you can't see the stage itself.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. It's the fundamental ground that makes our subjective experience of reality possible, allowing us to recognize a stream of different perceptions as belonging to a single I.
So, okay, even though Kant's transcendental ego is still quite different from, say, Eastern ideas of non-self, it does point towards something beyond just the immediate, fluctuating ego we usually think of. It really highlights that these kinds of questions about the self's nature and stability pop up across really different traditions. Even if they end up in different places, it sets the stage nicely for us to look east.
And if you look at more recent Western psychological ideas, the conversation just keeps evolving, often getting even more abstract, maybe. You have someone like Daniel Dennett who talks about the self as a kind of homunculus, you know, that little man inside controlling things.
Yeah, the little guy pulling the levers.
Exactly. But then he quickly says, well, that's just a convenient fiction. He argues the self is more like a center of narrative gravity. It's an emergent property arising from all the complex stuff happening in our brains rather than some single boss entity.
A center of narrative gravity. Okay, that sounds interesting.
And then you get these really fascinating narrative theories of self from people like Charles Taylor, Maria Scheckman, Hilda Nelson. Their idea is that the self isn't some static thing we find, but something that's actively constructed. It's built through this constant process of interpreting and weaving together the whole story of our lives, our chronological experiences.
So myself is the story I tell myself about who I am.
Basically, yeah, it's like a living autobiography that's constantly being written and rewritten with every new experience, every reflection. Think about how someone's sense of identity can shift after a huge life event, becoming a parent, surviving an illness, changing careers. Their internal story about who I am evolves, right? That's what these narrative theorists are pointing to.
So it's less about finding some pre-existing true self and more about actively creating and revising the story of your life. And that story becomes yourself.
Precisely. And then there's also social constructivism. This view is a bit more reductionist, maybe. It argues that the self is fundamentally built through social interactions. Your identity isn't really something internal you discover, but it's largely a product of your relationships, the cultural norms you live in, the societal structures shaping your experience. Think about how you might feel like a slightly different self at work versus with your family versus with your close friends. Each context helps construct a different facet of who you are.
Right. Different roles, different selves.
Yeah. But notice, even with all these more complex dynamic views, whether the self is a homunculus, a narrative, a social construct, they generally still hold on to the idea of a distinct individual self. It might be changeable, it might be shaped by society, but it's still yourself, separate from others. And that's a really key point that sets them apart from the deeper, often really radical negations of the self we find in Eastern traditions. Which brings us neatly to looking at that, well, often diametrically opposite perspective.
Okay, let's shift gears then and journey east, way back actually, to the roots of some incredibly profound spiritual and philosophical thinking. We're talking about the Upanishads, often called the wisdom literature of the Vedas in India. These texts, mostly from around the 8th to 6th centuries BCE, they're not really prescriptive religious texts like we might imagine. They often take the form of these intimate dialogues, conversations between teachers and students, almost like philosophical discussions captured for posterity.
Yeah, they're amazing texts.
And what's really fascinating is how they represent this big shift, a move away from focusing on external rituals, the elaborate ceremonies of earlier Vedic religion, towards exploring deeper inner meanings. They start asking these huge speculative questions about the universe's origins. Questions like, what's the ultimate cause? What is Brahman? Where do we come from? How do we live? What are we fundamentally based on? They're really digging for the ultimate truth behind existence itself.
And absolutely central to the Upanishads is this core, really profound realization that Atman, which is understood as like a person's inmost soul, their life breath, their deepest essence, is also Brahman. And Brahman is the ultimate reality, the energy or consciousness that pervades the entire universe.
Wow.
There's that powerful statement, reality beyond is also within. It perfectly captures it. It suggests that this transcendent, all-encompassing reality isn't separate from us. It's not distant or just out there. It's intimately connected to our deepest, innermost being. It's the very ground of who we are. And the teachers in the Upanishads, they often use examples, analogies, stories to try and convey this truth because it kind of defies normal language and understanding.
And that's where that famous fig tree analogy comes in, isn't it? So simple, but just incredibly powerful. Could you walk us through that again, really spell out what it's trying to get across?
Yeah, it's a classic for a reason. It's so insightful. So the story goes, a teacher asks his student, Svediketu, to bring him a fig. Then he says, open the fig. The student opens it, sees lots of tiny seeds inside. Then the teacher says, okay, now open one of those tiny seeds. The student does and says, sir, I see nothing at all inside.
Nothing.
Nothing visible. And then the teacher delivers this profound line. Truly, my son, from what you cannot see, from that subtle essence, the whole fig tree grows. That subtle essence is reality. That is Atman, that art thou, Svediketu.
That art thou.
It's just beautiful, isn't it? It illustrates that Brahman is this unseen, subtle essence that underlies everything, gives life to everything. Just like you can't see the life force, the blueprint, the potential within that tiny seed, but it's undeniably there, capable of producing this huge tree. In the same way, Brahman is the subtle essence pervading the whole universe. It's the same underlying living source within each of us, our Atman, as it is in the vast cosmos Brahman. It's pointing beyond the physical, beyond what our senses grasp, to the foundational reality, the invisible ground of being that makes everything else possible. It's asking you to look deeper. Now, while that analogy points to Brahman as this kind of immanent, pervading essence, other teachers in the Upanishads used a slightly different strategy to help students glimpse this ultimate reality. They sometimes spoke of Brahman as being wholly transcendent, meaning it's completely beyond human understanding, beyond our categories. So, to describe it, they would only say what Brahman is not.
Ah, the neti approach. Not this, not this.
Exactly. Neti. For example, you find passages describing Brahman like this. It is not coarse, not fine, not short, not long, odorless, tasteless, without eye, without ear, without voice, without name, unaging, undying, without measure, without inside, and without outside.
That's fascinating. It's like saying, whatever you think it is, it's not that. It's beyond any label or category your mind can possibly come up with. It almost forces you to just stop thinking conventionally.
Precisely the point. It's designed to stretch the human mind, push it beyond its usual categories, make it confront the limits of concepts and language. It forces you to try and glimpse something that simply cannot be contained or defined by human thought. It really emphasizes Brahman's completely transcendent nature, pushing the seeker towards an experience beyond just intellectual understanding, an ineffable reality that maybe can only be realized, not fully described.
Okay, so with such a profound, maybe even paradoxical concept at its heart, what does this actually mean for different schools of thought within Hinduism itself? It sounds like there probably isn't just one single straightforward teaching about how Atman and Brahman relate. How does that diversity play out?
You're absolutely right. Hinduism is incredibly diverse, more like a family of interconnected traditions than a single dogma. And yeah, Brahman is understood quite differently by these various schools. We saw this reflected even in those Reddit discussions we looked at, where practitioners themselves are working through these nuances.
Right.
So for instance, you have the Advaita Vedanta school, most famously associated with the philosopher Adi Shankara. This school holds that the individual soul, Atman and Brahman, are ultimately identical, pure non-dualism.
Identical, okay.
In this Advaita view, basically we're simply embodied aspects of Brahman. The ultimate reality isn't separate from you, it is you, ducked down. The path to liberation, or moksha, is simply to realize this, to overcome the illusion maya that makes us feel separate. One user, Sage34, used that great analogy we mentioned earlier.
The wave and the ocean.
Exactly. A wave may be called an individual self, where the ocean is the supreme self. The identity of the wave is same as that of the ocean, when thus the individual realizes that he is not confined to the name and form, but is all-pervading like the wave, realizing he is the ocean. It is called moksha. It perfectly illustrates Shankara's core teaching. Brahman alone is real, meaning permanent. The world is unreal, meaning impermanent. Jiva, the individual self Atman, and Brahman are identical. The feeling of being a separate I is seen as an illusion caused by Maya, this false overlay of name and form onto the one undifferentiated reality. Suffering comes from the wave thinking it's just a wave, separate from the vast ocean it's always been part of.
So the wave thinks it's this distinct little thing, but its true nature is, and always has been, the ocean itself.
Yes, Fiona.
Yeah, that's a really powerful image. Transforms how you see yourself.
It really does. Then you have Vishishtadvaita, which translates roughly as Advaita with qualifications, or qualified non-dualism. Here, Brahman alone exists, yes, but it's seen as being characterized by multiplicity. It's still a form of non-dualism, but one where diversity is real and part of the ultimate unity.
Okay, how does that work?
Think of it like a tree. The tree is one entity, that's Brahman, but it has many distinct parts. Branches, leaves, roots, those are like individual souls, jivas, and the material world. These parts are real, they're distinct, but they can't exist independently of the whole tree. So the individual souls are real, but they are considered modes or attributes of Brahman, not absolutely identical to it in every single way. There's both unity and real distinction within that unity.
Right, so the parts are real, but dependent on the whole.
Exactly. Then moving further, you have Achintya Bheda Abheda. This translates to something like inconceivable difference and non-difference. This tradition, which is prominent in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, posits that the relationship between God, or Brahman, and the individual soul is fundamentally incomprehensible to the human mind. It's somehow simultaneously different and non-different, and we just can't fully grasp how.
Inconceivable, okay.
Yeah. And this tradition introduces the concept of Paramatma, the Supreme Self, often seen as a form of Vishnu dwelling within every atom and alongside every living entity. This Paramatma is seen as all-pervading, ontologically equal with Brahman, the witness of all beings. Here, the individual self, the jiva, is said to suffer because it forgets its eternal relationship with this divine Paramatma. There's a beautiful scripture passage. On the same tree, the individual self, jiva, deluded by forgetfulness of his identity with the divine self, bewildered by his ego, grieves and is sad. But when he recognizes the other as the Lord worshipped by all in his glory, he becomes free from grief. So liberation here comes when the jiva remembers its eternal connection and dependence on Paramatma, serving it with devotion.
So it's less about realizing you are the divine and more about remembering this incredibly deep, eternal connection to it that was always there, kind of restoring a relationship rather than dissolving into oneness.
Precisely. It's much more of a devotional path, emphasizing that loving relationship between the individual soul and the Supreme. And then Just to show the full spectrum, you also have Advaita philosophy, which is a purely dualistic school. Advaita posits a total, fundamental duality between God and the soul. This is actually quite similar to many Western theological views, where the creator and the created are eternally distinct realities.
Right.
One Reddit user, National Conscript, identifying as a dualist, explained it clearly. For them, Atman is an eternal, conscious being, not the body, mind, or ego, just temporarily associated with them that transmigrates. Brahman, in this view, is like a Western concept of God, the creator, sustainer, destroyer of the material universe. But crucially, Brahman is not the creator of the Atmans themselves. The Atmans, just like God, have always existed. They reference the Bhagavad Gita here. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be.
Wow. So eternal souls, distinct from an eternal God.
Exactly. So look, despite this huge diversity in how Brahman and Atman are defined, how they relate from absolute identity to qualified unity to complete duality, there's still this powerful common thread running through many, though not all, of these Hindu traditions. It involves a really fundamental reevaluation of the individual self's perceived independence, its ultimate reality. It shifts the focus from, what am I as a separate individual, to, what am I part of? Or even, what am I truly beyond this illusion of separateness? And this profound shift in understanding the self naturally leads us to think about the practical implications, how these ideas affect the mind, affect well-being, which is where Eastern psychology really comes into its own.
That's a perfect transition, yeah. Because these aren't just, abstract philosophical ideas locked away in ancient texts. They translate into very different, really practical approaches to the mind and to well-being. That Saybrook University source we looked at really nails this foundational difference. Western psychology traditionally has often been geared towards diagnosing and treating pathology, addressing what's seen as wrong or broken in someone. Right. But Eastern approaches often seem to concentrate more on the basic function of the mind itself and on freeing everyone from suffering. The goal seems to be fostering optimal functioning for all individuals, whether they have a clinical diagnosis or not.
Exactly. Alan Watts, who was brilliant at explaining Eastern thought to Westerners, made this really sharp observation. He said, Western psychotherapy has mainly focused on changing the consciousness of disturbed individuals. The target has usually been those with clinical issues, people considered unwell by society standards.
Okay.
But disciplines like Buddhism, Taoism, their aim is often to change the consciousness of normal, socially adjusted people. Because from an Eastern perspective, pretty much all of us are, in a sense, in need of therapy, regardless of whether we seem clinically disturbed or perfectly normal. Why? Because the view is few of us are truly functioning free from the influence of, delusions, projections, uncurbed desires, all this stuff that causes suffering.
So we're all sort of deluded in a way, even if we seem fine on the surface.
That's a core idea, yeah. Let's unpack that a bit because it's crucial. Eastern psychologies often maintain that because of all our social conditioning, self-conditioning, our deeply held ambitions, our beliefs about ourselves and the world, our desires, our expectations, even our basic ideas about reality are actually illusory. They're mental constructs. They're not ultimate reality.
Okay.
And because we tend to think and act based on these illusions, these kind of distorting views of reality, we inevitably suffer. That suffering shows up as disappointment when things don't go our way, frustration when our desires aren't met, anxiety about what might happen, clinging to the past. It's the gap between our illusory view and how things actually are that causes this constant low-level or sometimes high-level suffering. For example, if you cling to the illusion that you absolutely must be successful all the time and never fail, then any little setback becomes a source of huge internal pain instead of just, a learning opportunity.
Right. So the solution isn't about fixing a specific pathology or just adjusting behavior, but about gaining this deep insight into our own minds and how they create these illusions in the first place. It sounds like a total re-education of how we perceive things.
That's exactly it. The core solution offered, especially through practices like meditation and mindfulness, is to really diligently examine the inner workings of our own minds. By doing that, we can start to understand the nature of illusion, how it pops up, how it colors everything we see, how it keeps us tied to suffering. And this isn't just an intellectual thing. It leads to a really profound experiential shift in attitude, in perspective. It lets us begin to see things as they truly are, hopefully free from those illusions, free from restrictive social ideas, free from our own projections. It's a path towards a more authentic, more genuine, and ultimately more liberating view of reality. And this brings us to a really fundamental difference in how the ego itself is viewed. In the West, like we said, the ego is usually central to identity, the core of who you are, the organizer. But from many Eastern perspectives, especially Buddhism, some Hindu schools, the ego is often seen as a social fiction or just a temporary construct. It's not a permanent, solid thing.
Social fiction.
Yeah. During meditation, for instance, practitioners often report realizing through direct experience that there's no fixed, unchanging I they can actually pin down. Instead, there's just this awareness that latches on to passing thoughts, judgments, sensations, and then mistakenly assumes that these fleeting things make up a solid, permanent ego. But since those thoughts, feelings, judgments are constantly changing, there can't really be a permanent structure called ego. It's like trying to grab smoke feels real for a second, but it's always shifting.
So the ego is more like this constantly shifting story, this collection of processes and temporary experiences, rather than some solid object we can point to and say, that's me.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. And Eastern traditions consistently teach this idea that everything is impermanent. Anicca in Buddhism, this isn't just philosophy. It's presented as a deep observation about the fundamental nature of reality. Just like your breath rises and falls, seasons change, clouds drift. All phenomena, including our thoughts, our emotions, even our most cherished sense of self, are seen as being in this constant process, arising, forming, changing, dissolving. There's no fixed point, no enduring essence you can hold on to. Totally. And this understanding, say in Taoism, this grasp of impermanence and the interconnectedness of everything, leads to concepts like wu-wei, which translates roughly as non-interference or maybe effortless action.
Wu-wei, how does that work?
It's about living in harmony with the natural flow of the Tao, the cosmic order. Through wu-wei, you learn to live and act in alignment with nature, to go with the flow of events rather than constantly resisting or struggling against them. But it doesn't mean being passive or doing nothing, not at all. Taoists are active in life, but they choose their actions to be in harmony with the natural way things unfold. Like a skilled surfer riding a wave, working with the energy, not fighting it. It's acting without striving, achieving without forcing, letting things happen naturally.
Acting without forcing. That sounds appealing.
It is. And the culmination of this kind of inner transformation in Eastern thought, it's described by various terms. Nirvana, satori, realization, awakening, enlightenment. They all point to a state of profound transcendence and liberation. The idea is that believing in this fictional ego, which is often so focused on protecting itself, validating itself, justifying itself, that belief is what stops us from seeing the underlying harmony and unity in all of life.
Yeah.
When those illusions fall away, when the ego's tight grip loosens, then this fundamental harmony isn't just an idea anymore. It becomes a direct lived experience, a state of deep peace and interconnectedness.
And this, thinking about well-being and psychological states, leads us to some genuinely fascinating data. Directly from a study in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, it takes these ancient Eastern ideas and brings them right into modern empirical research. We're talking about self-compassion, a concept that, yeah, like you said, comes straight out of Buddhist psychology. It's a fantastic example of these Eastern insights really finding their way into mainstream Western understanding and being measured for their impact.
Absolutely. Kristen Neff, who's really a pioneer in researching this, defined self-compassion back in 2003 as this multifaceted psychological thing. It has three main parts, all interconnected. First, there's self-kindness, which is basically about treating yourself with warmth and understanding when you mess up or suffer or feel inadequate instead of being really harsh and critical. Think about how you'd treat a good friend who's struggling, extending that same empathy, but to yourself.
Okay, kindness instead of judgment. Makes sense.
Second component is common humanity. This involves seeing your own personal experiences, your struggles as part of the larger human experience. It's recognizing that suffering, making mistakes, being imperfect, these are universal parts of being human. They're not some personal failing that makes you isolated or weird. So if you spill coffee all over yourself, instead of thinking, I'm such an idiot, I always do this, common humanity helps you think, oops, happens to everyone, just part of life.
Right, you're not alone in messing up.
Exactly. And the third part is mindfulness, which in this context means holding your painful feelings in mindful awareness, acknowledging them without judging them and without getting totally swept away by them, what they call over-identification. It's about observing your difficult thoughts and emotions as they arise without trying to immediately suppress them or, conversely, letting them completely take over your whole reality.
So it's not just about being vaguely nice to yourself. It's also realizing you're connected to others in your struggles and being aware of your feelings without being consumed by them. That feels much richer, much more nuanced than just, say, conventional self-esteem.
It really is. And the study we're looking at by Neff, Pisitsungkagarn, and Shea asks this really interesting question. Okay, given that self-compassion comes from Asian Buddhist psychology, do Asian cultures naturally just have higher levels of it compared to Western cultures? So to test this, they studied university students in 3 places: the US, Thailand, and Taiwan.
Why those 3?
They provided a great comparison. You've got Thailand with its very strong Theravada Buddhist cultural influence. You've got the US, typically seen as highly individualistic. And Taiwan, with its Confucian heritage, but also known for high academic pressure and competitiveness, a really interesting spectrum.
Okay, so what did they find? Was it higher in the East?
Well, the findings were actually quite surprising and definitely challenged any simple East-West assumptions. What they found for overall self-compassion was that it was highest in Thailand, mean score around 3.41, lowest in Taiwan, around 2.92, and the United States fell right in the middle, around 3.14. And importantly, all 3 groups were significantly different from each other statistically.
Wow. So Thailand highest, U.S. middle, Taiwan lowest. Not what you might expect if you just thought Eastern concept higher in the East.
Exactly. It shows it's much more complex, much more about the specific cultural context. And when they looked at the individual parts of self-compassion, the differences got even sharper. The Thai students consistently showed significantly more self-kindness than both the Americans and the Taiwanese. They also scored significantly lower on the negative aspects: self-judgment, feeling isolated, and over-identifying with negative emotions. Plus, the Thais reported higher mindfulness than the Americans.
Okay, so Thailand looking pretty good on the self-compassion front. What about Taiwan?
Taiwan was kind of the opposite profile. The Taiwanese students showed significantly higher levels of self-judgment, isolation, and over-identification. This paints a picture of a cultural context where perhaps self-criticism and feeling alone in your failures might be more common or intense. Americans, again, tended to fall somewhere between Thailand and Taiwan on most of these negative self-related feelings.
That's quite a range of psychological experience, isn't it? Especially in how people relate to themselves when things get tough. But what about common humanity? Did that vary much across the cultures?
Now that's fascinating and a really crucial point. They found no significant cross-cultural differences for the common humanity subscale.
None at all.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, the researchers speculated, and it makes sense that the Western concept of universal human rights, which really emphasizes shared human dignity, the inherent worth of every individual, that might align conceptually quite well with this idea of common humanity. So even though other cultural factors might push self-kindness or self-judgment in different directions, this underlying sense of shared human experience might be more similar across these cultures, possibly leveling out the scores on that specific component. It suggests a potential universal common ground, maybe. Now, thinking about why these differences exist, the researchers offered some interesting interpretations. For the U.S., with its moderate levels, they talked about the mixed messages in American culture. You've got this intense competitive drive, right? Individual achievement is huge. But you've also got this massive emphasis on self-esteem, feeling good about yourself. This tension might stop Americans reaching the highs of Thailand, but maybe also protects them from the lows seen in Taiwan.
Sort of pulled in 2 directions.
Kind of. Whereas in Thailand, they suggested the pervasive compassionate stance of Theravada Buddhism seems to directly translate into higher self-compassion, fostering kindness, acceptance, seeing shared suffering as part of the path. It seems to create a culture more conducive to it.
And this distinction between self-esteem and self-compassion, that seems really important here, because they measured self-esteem too, didn't they? And the results were different.
They were, yes. This is a key finding. The study found that the American participants actually had the highest self-esteem scores, followed by the Thai students, and then the Taiwanese students had the lowest.
So Americans highest on self-esteem, but middle of the road on self-compassion.
Exactly. And this is super important because it helps validate the self-compassion findings. It shows they're measuring different things. Self-compassion and self-esteem are distinct psychological constructs. They don't just move together across cultures. The researchers argued that the common tendency towards self-enhancement in the U.S., trying to feel superior, better than average, that's likely more about boosting self-esteem, which often has to do with social comparison, social rank, feeling better or worse than others. That's a very different psychological process than cultivating the self-warmth and self-care of self-compassion, which is about how you relate to yourself kindly, especially when you fail, not about needing to be better than other people. The study also dug into something called self-control, basically whether people tend to see themselves primarily as independent, focused on autonomy, personal goals, uniqueness, or as interdependent, focused on connections, relationships, group harmony, caring for others. And they looked at how this related to self-compassion in each culture.
What did they find there? Was one better for self-compassion?
Well, it was complex. It showed, again, how culture shapes the meaning of these things. In Thailand, having a more interdependent self-control actually predicted higher self-compassion. So feeling more connected was linked to more self-kindness, more common humanity, more mindfulness, and less self-judgment and isolation. This kind of makes sense, right? If your culture emphasizes interconnectedness and also promotes Buddhist compassion, then feeling connected probably reinforces being kind to yourself as part of caring for the whole.
Okay, interdependence helps in Thailand. But what about the U.S. and Taiwan? Was it the opposite? Because it seems counterintuitive that independence could predict self-compassion.
Yeah, that's where the nuance really shines. In the United States, it was actually having a more independent self-control that predicted higher self-compassion. More independence was linked to more self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, and less isolation.
Huh. So being more individualistic helped Americans be more self-compassionate.
Well, the thinking is, perhaps for Americans, a stronger focus on autonomy and personal needs might actually help them buffer themselves against some of the harsh competitive pressures in society that might otherwise fuel self-criticism. In a very individualistic culture, maybe sometimes prioritizing your own internal state, your own self-care, independent of external judgments, is the route to being kinder to yourself.
Okay, interesting twist. And Taiwan.
Taiwan had the most complicated picture, arguably the most revealing. Both independence and interdependence were linked to more self-kindness and mindfulness. Okay, fine. But crucially, interdependence was also linked to more self-judgment and over-identification with negative feelings. And surprisingly, interdependence was linked to more feelings of isolation, whereas independence, conversely, was linked to less isolation.
Wow, that's messy. Interdependence leading to more isolation. How does that work?
It suggests that the meaning and impact of interdependence can be really different depending on the cultural context. In Thailand, interdependence happens within a system that actively promotes self-compassion, so it enhances it. But in Taiwan, the researchers suggest if the culture values interdependence but doesn't strongly promote self-compassion alongside it, then the pressures of interdependence needing to conform, achieving for the family, avoiding shame might actually lead to more self-criticism and feeling isolated when you inevitably fall short of those high standards. In that kind of environment, paradoxically, maybe a degree of independence from those intense pressures could actually allow for the self-understanding and self-care needed for self-compassion. You can step back a bit. And this leads directly to what the study called the psychological cost, seen in Taiwan's very low self-compassion scores. They attributed this to high levels of negative self-relevant emotions, judging oneself harshly, feeling alone in one's failures, and running away with negative feelings. They even quoted from an ancient Chinese text the pedigree of the Zhou clan, which emphasizes rigorous self-improvement through shame. When a person does not know shame, his or her conscience would vanish. Without the will to strive upward, how could one improve?
So the cultural intention is clearly there. Use shame. Use rigorous self-assessment to drive improvement. But it sounds like it backfires psychologically, leading to harshness and isolation instead.
Exactly. Despite the noble intention of constructive self-improvement, this kind of harsh self-criticism, especially if it's paired with cultural practices involving shaming or threats of ostracism for failure, can create what the study calls problematic negative self-to-self relating and a significant psychological cost. It suggests that while self-criticism might seem like a good motivator, it can actually be counterproductive, leading to anxiety, distress, maybe even self-sabotage. Self-compassion, on the other hand, provides the emotional safety needed to see the self clearly without fear of self-condemnation. And paradoxically, that safety actually allows for more effective personal growth, because you're not constantly fighting this internal battle. You can learn from mistakes without feeling crushed by them.
Okay, this feels like the absolute killer takeaway from this whole study. The research found that self-compassion was significantly associated with less depression and greater life satisfaction in all three cultures: Thailand, the United States, and Taiwan. That feels huge.
It is huge. That list is remarkably robust. It really demonstrates the universal benefits of self-compassion for just basic psychological well-being. Even in Taiwan, where the average self-compassion levels were the lowest, having more self-compassion was still strongly linked to having less depression. The correlation with reduced depression was consistently strong across all three cultures, suggesting this powerful universal effect no matter your cultural background or your starting point with self-compassion.
Right.
Now, the link to life satisfaction was a bit weaker in Thailand, but that could simply be because in a culture where self-compassion is already generally high, maybe other factors like income, health, social support become relatively more important in predicting overall life satisfaction. But the core finding is solid. Cultivating self-compassion seems to have direct, measurable, and universally positive impacts on your mental health, your sense of peace, your contentment. It really doesn't matter where you're from. It's an ancient concept with profound, modern, global relevance.
That's incredibly powerful, yeah. And it brings us right back, in a way, to those more abstract philosophical ideas we started with, specifically how Eastern traditions really fundamentally challenge or even negate many of the core assumptions the West often makes about the self. That selfhood and identity source we looked at laid this out really clearly, almost like a point-by-point rebuttal.
It does, and thinking about it that way is really helpful for understanding just how deep the differences go. Western thought, often without us even realizing it, tends to operate on several deep-seated assumptions about what a self is. First, there's that basic subject-object distinction. The idea of the I as the knower, the subject being separate from the me as the known, the object of my thoughts or perceptions. We constantly talk about my thoughts, my feelings, my body, right? Creating this mental separation.
Do that constantly.
Second, there's a strong emphasis on self-other demarcation and individual identity. The self is seen as distinct, unique, something owned by the individual, and fundamentally separate from other selves. We think of ourselves as these independent, self-contained units bouncing around. And third, there's the idea of the centrality and sovereignty of selfhood. The self is often treated as the measure of all things, implying mastery, control, a kind of dominant position in our own psychological world. It's inherently individual, not dividual, meaning not easily divisible or shared, and this often leads to this feeling of egoic control over our own destiny.
Okay, so subject-object split, separate individual identity, and the self being in charge. Those are the Western defaults, basically.
Broadly speaking, yeah, those are powerful underlying currents. Now, Eastern traditions often don't just offer an alternative view, they actively negate these ideas, and this negation leads towards what's sometimes called psychological decentering, moving away from that egocentric viewpoint. Let's see how this works in different traditions. Take Taoism, for example. The very idea of the Tao as this unitary, undifferentiated cosmic principle the way inherently negates that subject-object distinction. If the Tao is everything, there's no fundamental I separate from that. Chuang Tzu, the great Taoist sage, insisted on the equality of all things. He thought seeing the world in rigid dichotomy, subject-object, good-bad, life-death, was arbitrary and ultimately pointless.
Like the butterfly dream.
Exactly. His famous dream where he didn't know if he was Chuang Tzu dreaming he was a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he was Chuang Tzu. He called this the transformation of things, a profound subject-object reversal. The point wasn't to figure out which one was real. The point was to see that framing identity in terms of a fixed subject versus object leads you nowhere. Identity is fluid. Those distinctions are ultimately illusory.
So the goal is to sort of dissolve those boundaries, see beyond the labels we stick on everything, including ourselves. Sounds like embracing radical fluidity.
That's a great way to put it. And in Taoism, when it comes to that self-other separation and the idea of self-sovereignty, the Taoist self isn't seen as distinct from the cosmos. It's understood as being part of it, in deep harmony with it. Chuang Tzu famously said, "The perfect man has no self." This idea of selflessness means dissolving those rigid boundaries between you and others, thinking of others as I, embracing both other in self and self in other. It's like a deconstructed Western self. It's decentered, it's multidimensional, it's not trying to dominate or control nature, but cultivating selflessness in order to feel at home in the cosmos. It's about aligning with cosmic forces, submitting to the flow, rather than fighting to impose your individual will.
Okay. And Buddhism, it takes it even further, right? The whole no-self doctrine.
It really does. The core Buddhist doctrine of no-self anatta is a radical negation of the very existence of a permanent individual self. It asserts that all phenomena, including persons, are in constant flux. anicca, impermanence, and therefore cannot possess any unchanging, fixed identity. Because everything is always changing, there just can't be a stable you that endures from moment to moment.
And believing there's a self is the problem.
Exactly. From this perspective, the very belief in a permanent individual self is seen as the root source of suffering, dukkha. Why? Because it creates attachment, clinging, desire, and fear of loss in a world that is, by its very nature, impermanent and interconnected. We suffer because we try to hold on to things, including our idea of self, that are inherently transient.
So the goal is?
The ultimate goal in Buddhism is liberation from this illusion of self, reaching nirvana, which is described as a transcendent state completely devoid of self-reference, a state of profound peace, freedom from suffering. Later Mahayana schools developed the concept of emptiness, sunyata. This means a mind empty of a fixed self, empty of cravings, but importantly, not the non-existence of mind itself. It's about cultivating a selfless self, aiming for a mindless mind. These paradoxical terms try to point towards a state where the mind is present, but totally free from clinging to concepts, including the concept of I.
Mindless mind. Wow.
And here's a really mind-bending paradox in Buddhism, especially challenging for Western ways of thinking. Individual effort, discipline, practice. These are seen as absolutely necessary for achieving liberation. Yet the philosophy simultaneously holds that there is no individual agent or self seeking its own salvation at all.
Wait, how does that work? You strive for salvation, but the you striving doesn't really exist.
Yeah, it's tricky. Salvation or liberation isn't seen as a personal redemption in the sense of saving my individual soul. It's understood more as a phenomenon of change in the cosmic scheme of things. It's a fundamental shift in perspective, a transformation that benefits the whole pattern, not just one illusory node within it. The individual's effort plays a part in altering the cosmic flow, but the ultimate benefit isn't conceived of in terms of the ego's personal salvation.
That really flips our usual script about purpose and identity on its head. Intense effort, but not for my benefit in the end. Wow.
It absolutely does. And then if we look at Hinduism, again, specifically Advaita Vedanta, the idea of a separate individual self is also seen as an illusion, maya, born out of primal ignorance, avidya. If the true self, Atman, is ultimately identical to the one, unitary Brahman, the undifferentiated ultimate reality, then logically Atman cannot have an individual identity. It cannot be owned by the individual. All those feelings and thoughts that make up our sense of individual identity, they're seen as illusions that are ultimately obliterated in the final realization, the dissolution of the apparent self back into Brahman. If there's only one reality, then any distinction between me and you, or humans and animals, is ultimately just part of the illusion. Now, a really distinctive and critical contribution from Vedanta to the psychology of consciousness is this idea of the self as witness. This is key. Western philosophy, like Kant's transcendental ego, often talks about a self as knower, an active ego that builds models of the world, plans things, interprets experiences, feels the consequences. This self as knower is the part of us that engages, thinks, judges, decides. But as Vedanta points out, this self as knower is constantly changing, often reactive, often completely unaware of its own biases or ignorance.
Right, the busy thinking part of us.
Exactly. Vedanta, however, posits an underlying, unchanging, fundamental self as witness. This witness is the passive, uninvolved true self. It's pure consciousness that simply observes all the mental activity, thoughts, feelings, sensations, without getting caught up in them, without engaging. It's often described like a blank slate or a clear mirror reflecting whatever happens in the mind, but remaining unaffected itself. Imagine being in a chaotic train station. The self as knower is the busy traveler, rushing, planning, reacting. The self as witness is like a silent, still camera, just recording everything without judgment, without getting involved, simply seeing.
So the active doing part of us, the part we usually identify with, isn't the true self. It's this quiet, observing, unmoving awareness behind it all. That feels profoundly different from how we usually experience ourselves.
It is profoundly different. And trying to know the self as knower intellectually is already tricky because it's always shifting. But trying to truly know the self as witness, the true self, is even more complex. Because Vedanta argues it cannot be known in the usual cognitive sense, through thought or concepts. It can only be experienced. The Upanishads themselves asked that profound question. With what means could the knower be known?
How can the thing doing the knowing know itself?
Exactly. While Western phenomenology often assumes consciousness is always intentional, always directed towards some object, Upanishadic thinkers claim to have discovered non-intentional states of consciousness, extraordinary states where that subject-object split dissolves. They talked about reaching a no-thought zone, a state where knower and known become one, where all conceptual thinking just suspends. It's described as a transcognitive state where knowledge in the ordinary sense doesn't apply. It's ineffable, beyond words.
So you can't think your way to experiencing the true self.
According to this view, no. To truly know the self as witness, the true self is impossible in an intellectual way. It can only be experienced. And this isn't like reverting to a blank slate mind of a baby. It actually requires a purposeful attempt to undo construals already written, a process of deconditioning, of erasing the effects of past learning, memory, habits, to experience that pure, passive witnessing mind underneath it all. And in principle, you can't even empirically compare individual true selves because their nature can't be cognitively known or measured. From the Advaita perspective, any apparent individual differences are just varied manifestations of the one single reality, Brahman. Any belief in an unchanging, distinct individual self is considered a misunderstanding because it would imply multiple ultimate realities, which contradicts the core non-dual premise. So really, psychological decentering is the big unifying theme across many of these Eastern approaches. It directly challenges that egocentric predicament, our natural tendency to see everything from our own limited, self-centered viewpoint. This decentering helps us shed prejudices, broaden our perspective, move beyond just me, me, me. Even Confucianism, which doesn't negate the self-other boundary in quite the same radical way, still emphasizes relational selfhood. Your identity comes primarily from how you harmonize your relationships with others, not from some isolated inner core. It fosters humility through the principle of likening to oneself, the Confucian golden rule, basically seeing others as extensions of yourself to guide ethical behavior and create a harmonious society.
It's so clear, isn't it? While Western thought often really prizes sovereignty, individual control, the distinct ego, these Eastern ideals tend to champion humility, interconnectedness, and this profound, maybe unsettling understanding that the self is not the measure of all things. It's a fundamental, deeply challenging shift in perspective about our place in the world and how we should live in it.
And that brings us to a really compelling question now. Is there potential for integrating these incredibly rich Eastern insights with Western psychological approaches? I mean, we're already seeing it happen, right? The explosion of interest in mindfulness within Western psychology is a huge example.
Yes, yeah.
And that self-compassion study we discussed, it really suggested that self-compassion might be a concept that beautifully integrates concerns with self and other in a manner that transcends individualistic or collectivistic orientations. It hinted that maybe autonomy, so prized in the West, and connectedness, so valued in the East, don't have to be opposites. They can actually be mutually supportive.
That's such a hopeful point. It suggests maybe they aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe we can have both. And could we use findings like that to actually reshape how we approach mental health globally? Maybe move beyond just focusing on pathology.
It's a hugely exciting possibility. The potential is immense. Imagine developing universal well-being frameworks that are genuinely built on these robust cross-cultural understandings, drawing on the strengths of both traditions. If something like self-compassion, rooted in Buddhist psychology, demonstrably benefits psychological well-being universally, it really opens the door, doesn't it? For other Eastern contemplative practices, different types of meditation, awareness practices, ethical frameworks be rigorously studied and potentially integrated into a more holistic, maybe more preventative, and certainly more universally applicable approach to mental health and human flourishing worldwide. It could fundamentally shift the focus from just managing symptoms to actively cultivating well-being.
Okay, but we also have to be realistic, right? While these Eastern philosophies and psychological ideals are incredibly profound and inspiring, what does history, what does real life tell us about how they actually play out in practice? Do these lofty ideals always translate perfectly into how societies actually function?
That's a crucial, very fair point to raise. We need the reality check. H.G. Wells, the historian, famously lamented what he saw as the potential corruption of the Eastern faiths. He suggested they sometimes lacked a strong self-cleansing element, allowing them to sometimes degenerate over time. He observed how they sometimes absorbed local deities, rituals, superstitions almost from the start, occasionally seeming to drift away from their original philosophical depths towards more ritualistic or even materialistic forms. It highlights that persistent gap that can open up between a profound philosophical ideal and how it actually manifests in a complex human society.
Yeah, ideals meet reality.
Exactly. For instance, you can find examples where religious Taoism or Buddhism have, in some contexts, seemed to, well, degenerate into materialism and superstition. Think about practices like burning fake paper money at funerals to appease spirits that seems a long way from the core philosophical ideas of emptiness or unity with the Tao. And even Confucian cultures today, while having many strengths, can sometimes be described as potentially subdued, constricted, perhaps stifling individual creativity or dissent, due to the very strong emphasis on hierarchy, conformity, and social harmony, sometimes taking precedence over individual expression. This isn't really a critique of the core philosophies themselves, but more an observation about how human cultures adapt, interpret, and sometimes distort these powerful ideas over time.
Right. And there was another critique mentioned about social change.
Yes, and it's an important one. A significant critique often leveled, particularly at traditional Buddhism and Hinduism, is that they tend to trace the root of suffering primarily to primal ignorance located within the self, that illusion of a separate ego or a misunderstanding of reality. Because of this internal focus, the traditional prescriptions for salvation often, at least initially, ignore totally any reference to social change. Liberation became seen as a largely personal matter, focused on transforming one's own mind, somewhat disconnected from addressing external social conditions, poverty, injustice, or systemic problems.
So focus inward, and the external world sort of takes care of itself, or isn't the main point.
That was often the emphasis, yeah. Now, it's important to note that later Mahayana Buddhism did introduce the powerful ideal of the bodhisattva, dedicating oneself selflessly to help all sentient beings achieve liberation, which implies a strong, compassionate engagement with the world. But the initial and enduring focus in many influential schools remained intensely internal, and this does contrast sharply with much of Western psychology and social thought, which has increasingly engaged with societal factors, systemic oppression, community-level interventions as crucial parts of mental health and well-being. It's a reminder that while the philosophical insights from these Eastern traditions are incredibly potent, their practical application and their translation into broader societal action can be complex, sometimes limited, and perhaps occasionally fall short of addressing the full spectrum of human suffering, especially when confronting large-scale, real-world social problems.
Wow. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've really done a deep dive into what it means to be you, or maybe, perhaps, what it might mean for you not to be, in the way we usually think. From the Western focus on the individual ego, exploring its nuances and critiques, all the way to the radical Eastern concepts of the non-self, the unity of Atman and Brahman, then bridging that with the practical, measurable power of self-compassion, and finally that profound idea of psychological decentering. It feels like we've journeyed through territory that challenges some of our deepest, most fundamental assumptions about ourselves.
It really does. And this whole exploration, I think, just highlights that the problem of the self, the mystery of consciousness, it remains largely unsolved globally. There are these vastly diverse approaches, each offering different strengths, different insights, but understanding these varied perspectives, I believe, offers incredibly powerful tools. Tools for shifting our perception of reality and uncovering potent paths towards inner peace, towards well-being, regardless of where you happen to be starting from in the world. And those universal benefits of something like self-compassion for psychological health are particularly compelling, aren't they? Showing how an ancient Eastern concept can directly, profoundly enhance modern life, even in cultures that seem, on the surface, very far removed from its origins. So here's a final thought to maybe leave you with. If the ultimate reality of ourself truly is ineffable, if it's beyond words, beyond concepts, and can ultimately only be experienced rather than known intellectually, as some of these profound Eastern traditions suggest, what does that really imply about the limits of our usual tools? The limits of language, the limits of science, maybe even limits of our own rational minds in truly understanding ourselves and the universe we inhabit. And maybe more personally, how might pursuing that direct experience rather than just more intellectual understanding fundamentally change your path towards self-transformation, toward finding a deeper sense of inner peace?
A truly profound thought to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.